Hey friends, wherever you're listening from tonight, whether it's a quiet farmhouse wrapped in frost or a small apartment where the hum of the heater replaces the sound of a wood fire, take a deep breath, settle in, and let's travel back to a time when staying warm wasn't a guarantee, but a victory. Out there on the American frontier, winter didn't whisper. It roared. Temperatures could fall faster than the sun sank below the horizon, and the night was not something to endure lightly. It was an adversary, invisible, patient, and merciless. Every creak of the log walls, every flicker of the fire was a reminder that comfort was fragile, and life depended on preparation measured in cords of wood, hands of wool, and hearts that refused to give up. It's strange to imagine, isn't it? No electricity, no furnace waiting to be turned up when your breath fogs the air, just the steady glow of a single fire, the sighing of wind through chinks in the wall, and the hope that what you'd built was strong enough to hold back death until morning. And yet, they did it. Families like the Morrisons, living in cabins miles from the nearest neighbor, found ways to turn cold into endurance, fear into knowledge, and knowledge into survival. Let's start there, with one such night. The year is 1881. A hard, bright moon hangs over the frozen plains of the Dakota Territory, silver light catching on the edges of snowdrifts that rise like frozen waves. Inside a cabin no larger than a modern living room, Thomas Morrison kneels before the fire, his breath misting as he stokes the coals with deliberate care. The logs he adds are heavy, seasoned oak, split just right, wide enough to last, dry enough to burn clean. Behind him, his wife Sarah adjusts the thick quilts around their two children, tucking the edges beneath them the way her mother once taught her back in Illinois. Every sound outside, the groan of timber, the shriek of wind, feels closer in winter, as if the cold itself has ears. The fireplace glows like a small sun, its stones, darkened by years of smoke, hold the day's heat and slowly give it back, hour by hour. Thomas understands this as more than comfort. It's the difference between waking to the sound of his children breathing and waking to silence. The old settlers used to say that a good fire is a man's most loyal friend. It demands care, attention, and respect, but if treated right, it will stand guard all night long. Their cabin was built for that purpose, for survival. The walls, double-layered with dried moss packed between the logs, are thicker than a man's arm. The floor is raised above the frozen earth, straw and pine needles stuffed beneath it to keep the frost from creeping up. And still, it's not enough to simply build a fire. The fire must be taught to last. As Sarah moves to the window, she presses her palm against the glass and feels the thin film of ice forming there. Outside, the wind carries fine snow that stings the face like needles. Inside, it's nearly peaceful, but she knows peace is a fragile thing in a frontier winter. Thomas banks the fire, piling on the largest logs before gently closing the damper to slow the burn. In the faint orange light, you can see how methodical the act is. The careful layering, the placement of coals, the instinctive adjustments made by a man who's done this 1,000 times before. The room fills with the dry, steady crackle of wood, the hiss of sap, the faint scent of smoke and iron. On the mantel above, a kettle of water simmers quietly, throwing soft clouds of steam that glisten in the lamplight. The children are already asleep, their cheeks pink, their breaths even. Sarah sits by their bedside, rubbing warmth into their small hands while Thomas checks the damper one last time. Then together they listen. To live through a frontier winter was to live by the sound of your fire. If it burned too fast, you'd wake to frost on the blankets. Too slow, and the air would turn deadly before dawn. Each family had their own rhythm, the hour they rose to add a log, the trick they'd learned from a neighbor or a passing traveler, and as the hours deepen into night and the wind outside claws at the corners of the cabin, the fire burns low and steady, the stones by the hearth radiate their stored warmth, and a small family, far from the world's noise, closer to the edge of it, dreams beneath quilts and furs while the wilderness howls outside. That's how the night begins. The first of many in a winter that will test everything they've built. And in the flicker of that humble fire lies the secret to how ordinary people with nothing but patience and wood and knowledge, passed down through calloused hands, managed to survive the coldest nights in the wilderness. By morning, the wind has quieted, leaving a world sculpted in silence. The snow outside gleams like crushed glass beneath a pale sun that gives light but no warmth. Inside the Morrison cabin, the air feels heavy and still, layered with the faint scent of smoke, wool, and pine. Thomas stirs first, shaking snow from the windowsill where it's drifted through the smallest cracks. The fire, though low, still breathes, a faint red glow buried beneath the ash. He smiles quietly to himself. The fire banking worked. It always did when done right. Sarah rises soon after, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, her breath misting as she moves toward the wall. She lays her palm against it. Still warm. What keeps that warmth trapped isn't just luck or sturdy logs. It's the hidden secret between the walls, the insulation that every frontier family learned to build with their own hands. The insulation revolution, as historians would later call it, wasn't invented by scientists in cities, but by mothers, trappers, and lumbermen who refused to freeze to death. The wilderness taught them everything. The forest gave them the materials, and necessity taught them how to use them. The Morrison cabin, like many built after the terrible winter of 1875, was double-walled, a design born from bitter experience. The outer wall faced the blizzards. The inner wall cradled the family. Between them lay a secret layer of life-saving material: moss, fur, and clay. The gap, roughly the width of a man's hand, was filled tightly with dried sphagnum moss collected in the summer and spread to dry on the roof for weeks until it turned brittle and feather-light. When pressed between the walls, it trapped air, and air was the true insulator. Thomas had gathered it himself, wading knee-deep through a marsh in August, while the mosquitoes swarmed. Sarah had dried it, kneeling in the sun, turning it every few days until the moisture was gone. Now in December, that same moss kept her children from freezing in their sleep. Mixed into the moss were finer things: sheep's wool brushed from the flock in spring, rabbit fur from the trap lines, even strands of hair saved from haircuts. Nothing was wasted. Every fibre, every scrap of nature's warmth was part of their defense against the cold. The clay that sealed the logs, called chinking, was made thick and dense, a blend of river mud, chopped straw, and sometimes a touch of animal hair. When it dried, it hardened into a shield that kept out the wind, yet breathed enough to let the cabin dry after snowmelt. Sarah would check it every few days, pressing her hand against the seams, feeling for any whisper of a draft. If she found one, she'd mix a new batch, slap it into the crack, and smooth it down with the back of her hand. Under the floor was another layer of hidden insulation, straw and pine needles packed into the crawl space to keep frost from creeping upward. Some families went further, keeping chickens or goats beneath the planks to share their warmth. The Morrisons didn't have livestock yet, but they still scattered dried hay beneath the floorboards every winter. At the ceiling, the roof was a masterpiece of necessity. Bark and split wood formed the base, above which Sarah and Thomas had stacked layers of moss, leaves, and finally a thick sod of earth that turned green in summer and white with snow in winter. That living roof didn't just keep rain out, it held heat in, the soil acting as a blanket a foot thick. When snow settled over it, it added yet another layer of insulation, sealing in the warmth below. At night, when temperatures plunged, Sarah hung quilts and furs over the windows. Thick elk hide curtains that she'd stitched herself swayed gently with every gust of wind. Around the doorframe she'd fitted strips of tanned leather, soft and pliant, closing the smallest cracks where drafts could sneak in. Even the door had a double layer, a smaller entryway that opened into a narrow vestibule, creating a buffer zone where cold air could die before reaching the family inside. It's easy to forget, sitting in a modern room with central heat, that a cabin like this was a living machine, breathing, expanding, shrinking, and sweating with the weather. Every material had to be chosen, placed, and maintained. Every mistake could mean a night of frozen water buckets and stiff fingers. As the day warms to a fragile noon, Thomas steps outside to split wood while Sarah tends the stew pot over the open hearth. The inside walls glow faintly golden, the air soft with heat that no one in the cities would believe possible in a log house. Their children chase one another around the room in wool socks, laughter echoing against the timber walls, proof that comfort could exist even in a world made of frost. This is what survival looked like on the frontier. Not a single grand invention, but 1,000 small acts of understanding. The forest provided, the family adapted, and the home itself became a fortress against extinction. Outside, the horizon blurs with snow. Inside, a family sits down to eat by the warmth of a fire that will burn until dawn, surrounded by walls that remember the hands that built them. Night returns early that winter, the kind of darkness that seems to swallow sound, where even the crack of an axe or the creak of ice in the trees feels distant and unreal. The Morrison children, Lily and James, are already in bed, their cheeks flushed from the heat of the fire. Sarah moves quietly around them, tucking another fur at the edge of the blanket, adjusting a warm stone wrapped in wool near their feet. To anyone else, it might look like a simple bedtime ritual, but here on the frozen frontier, it is an act of survival. Body heat management. That was the true secret of the frontier winter. Every family, every settler, every trapper learned that warmth didn't come only from the fire. It came from within. From the body's own flame, a fragile but powerful engine that could be stoked, preserved, and multiplied. The Morrison family understood that lesson well. Their clothing was their first defense, and every layer had a purpose. Closest to the skin was linen, soft and breathable, followed by heavy wool shirts and trousers. Over that came wool vests, coats lined with rabbit fur, and thick mittens knitted from the fleece of their own sheep. Wool, Sarah always said, was worth its weight in gold, because even when damp with melted snow, it still held the heat. At night, the same principle guided how they slept. Wool against the skin, then quilts, then furs, each layer trapping a thin film of air that the body slowly warmed. Above them hung a canopy of heavy fabric that Sarah had stitched from old flour sacks, and beneath them lay a mattress of straw and down that separated their bodies from the cold of the floor. To sleep close to the ground without insulation was a death sentence. Every frontiersman knew that. But the real marvel, the trick passed down from the oldest settlers, was the heated stones. Every evening before bed, Thomas would place smooth river stones near the edge of the fire, turning them now and then with an iron poker until they glowed faintly with warmth. When they were ready, Sarah wrapped them in wool blankets or old pieces of flannel and carried them carefully to the children's bed. The stones radiated heat for 6, sometimes 8 hours, keeping the air around the sleepers just warm enough to make the difference between comfort and hypothermia. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, they used bricks instead, or iron pots filled with embers, sealed tight and placed safely near the bed's edge. These improvised radiators turned the bed into a tiny oasis of warmth in a world that could kill a man in minutes. Shared warmth was another secret, as ancient as humanity itself. The family slept together, close, layered like a living bundle. The smallest children were always placed between the adults, where their fragile bodies could draw from the steady heat of their parents. There was no shame in it, no awkwardness. It was simple arithmetic. Together they generated more heat than apart. Sarah knew how to read her children's breathing. When their shivers slowed, when their hands softened in her grasp, she whispered stories softly into the darkness, not to entertain but to keep them calm, because fear, she knew, made people colder. Fear tightened the chest, slowed the blood, and drained what little warmth the body had left. Calm, steady breathing kept the fire inside alive. Before they slept, the Morrisons would each drink something warm, milk with a bit of molasses for the children, tea or broth for the adults. Heat from the inside, Thomas said, was worth twice as much as heat from the outside. Food that digested slowly. Fat, beans, oats would keep their bodies burning all night. And when the air grew bitter, when the wind found a way through the smallest crack and the fire's glow dimmed to embers, they turned to motion. Sarah taught the children to wiggle their fingers and toes, to flex their hands and feet beneath the blankets. She herself would rise sometimes, pacing quietly around the room, lifting her arms, rolling her shoulders, whispering prayers that sounded more like breaths than words. Each movement stirred blood, and blood meant warmth. The Morrisons weren't unique in this. Across the frontier, families did the same. They learned that survival meant not just building a home that held heat, but living in a rhythm that conserved it. Breathing, moving, layering, eating. Every action measured, every gesture part of an invisible system designed to keep life flickering through the frozen dark. Out on the plains, where the nearest neighbor could be 10 miles away, there were no second chances. You didn't wait to feel cold. You stayed ahead of it, fed your fire, fed your body, fed your courage. And as the night deepens once more, the Morrison cabin stands silent and strong beneath the weight of snow. Inside, the faint glow of embers lights the room with the soft orange of safety. The children sleep between their parents, the stones at their feet still warm, their breaths rising and falling in unison. Outside, the wind prowls, but it cannot enter. The family, wrapped in layers of warmth, in knowledge and in love, has already won the night. Sometime past midnight, the wind changed. It came suddenly, moaning through the cracks with a sound that could wake even the heaviest sleeper. The Morrison cabin groaned under its weight, the timbers flexing like an old ship at sea. Thomas opened his eyes to darkness, and in that moment he knew the fire was out. The air had turned sharp and heavy. His breath came out in a cloud so thick it looked like smoke. The walls no longer radiated warmth. The room felt hollow, stripped of its life. Beside him, Sarah stirred, clutching the blankets closer around their children. She didn't need to speak. They had practiced this moment 100 times in their heads. The emergency protocols. Frontier families didn't wait for help. There was none to come. They prepared for the night their fire died, for the gust that stole the last ember, for the hour when cold became an enemy with a face. Every movement now was deliberate, honed by repetition. Thomas was up first. He moved to the hearth and crouched down, blowing softly into the ashes, searching for the dull red spark that might still hide there. Nothing. The coals were black and dead. The temperature outside had dropped to 40 below, and the cabin was following fast. He could feel it in his fingertips. The numbness, the sting. He didn't have long. Sarah reached under the bed for the emergency kit, a small wooden box sealed with wax to keep out moisture. Inside was their last line of defense: tinder, charcloth, flint, and steel. She struck the first spark while Thomas gathered kindling, dried moss, shavings, and a sliver of birch bark so thin it curled like paper. The first spark failed. The second too. On the third, a faint orange glow appeared, and both of them leaned close, cupping it with trembling hands until the flame caught. Outside, the wind howled, but inside, a miracle flickered to life. They fed the flame with small twigs, then larger sticks, then a single piece of seasoned oak. The fire began to breathe again, slow and steady. The children hadn't woken yet, but their small hands were cold, their lips pale. Sarah pulled them close, wrapping them together beneath the thickest fur, skin against skin. That was the fastest way to bring warmth back. Frontier doctors had known it well. The human body is its own furnace. One had written, but the fuel is courage. The emergency plan always had layers. If the fire couldn't be saved, they would burn whatever they must. Furniture, tools, even pieces of the floor. Heat meant life. Possessions could be replaced in spring. The Morrison cabin had already been tested once before, 2 winters ago when snow collapsed their chimney and left them without a fire for nearly a day. They'd survived by turning the dining table into kindling and sealing themselves inside the smallest room with blankets nailed to the walls. Thomas still remembered the sound of the nails creaking in the cold, the way every breath had felt like glass. Tonight, though, they had the flame again. He smiled faintly, watching it grow, that faint orange light crawling across the stones like dawn returning early. Sarah moved to the shelves and fetched a jar of honey and a small slab of cured pork fat. High-calorie food was medicine in the cold. She warmed the honey near the fire until it ran like liquid gold, then gave each child a spoonful. The sweetness stirred them awake, and colour began to return to their faces. If the fire failed again, there was a backup, 2 iron pans blackened with years of use, ready to hold glowing embers and radiate heat beside the bed, and if that failed, well, they had the group formation. Sarah had drilled it into the children like a game. When she called bundle, everyone would crawl close together beneath the furs, smallest in the middle, parents on the outside. The warmth of 4 bodies could hold back the cold longer than anyone could alone. Thomas checked the walls for frost bloom, the white lace of ice that crept through when insulation failed. He pressed his palm against the chinking. Still dry, still holding. He exhaled, feeling a tiny thread of relief wind through the exhaustion. Out on the plains, many hadn't been so lucky. There were stories of families found in the spring, frozen where they slept, still clutching one another. Every winter was a lottery, and the prize was life. Those who survived didn't do so by chance. They did it because they had rehearsed survival until it became instinct. The fire crackled louder now, feeding on thick logs that Thomas had split by moonlight weeks ago, just in case. He adjusted the damper to trap the heat, then wrapped his hands around a tin mug of warm broth. Sarah smiled at him faintly. Not because the night was over, but because they had passed the test again. That was the frontier way. The cold would come again and again and again, and every time they would meet it with preparation, patience, and faith that the small things, the spark, the stone, the shared breath, could stand against the immensity of winter. Outside, the wind was still screaming across the Dakota plains, shaking the trees and rattling the frozen eaves. But inside, the Morrison family had built their own sunrise. A fire reborn from ash, a cabin held together by knowledge, and a silence warm enough to outlast the storm. By dawn, the storm had spent itself. The wind, once furious, had fallen silent, leaving a frozen stillness that felt older than the land itself. Snow blanketed the prairie in smooth, untouched waves. From the Morrison cabin, a faint thread of smoke rose straight into the pale blue sky, the single sign of life in a world locked in ice. Inside, the fire still burned, low but steady, throwing a golden pulse against the log walls. Sarah sat near it, her shawl pulled close, eyes half closed from exhaustion. The children slept soundly at last, their faces soft in the orange glow. Thomas stood by the door, staring out through the frost-patterned window at the white horizon. His breath fogged the glass, mingling with the lace of ice. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he whispered, almost to himself, "We made it." What he didn't say, what no one on the frontier ever needed to say, was that survival here was never a matter of strength alone. It was understanding. The kind that came not from books or teachers, but from observation, from failure, from nights when the cold nearly won. The wilderness did not reward bravery. It rewarded wisdom. Every family that endured these winters became part of a quiet lineage of knowledge, unrecorded, but passed hand to hand, generation to generation. How to read the sky before a blizzard, how to feel the moisture in a log and know whether it would burn, how to bank a fire so that the last ember would outlast the darkest night. That knowledge was sacred in its own way. It meant that each act, splitting wood, hanging blankets, sharing a bed, became a ritual of life. It meant that even in a place where everything froze, the human spirit did not. When the sun finally broke through the window, light spilled across the floorboards, illuminating the frost that had crept along the doorframe. The room shimmered faintly, glowing with warmth and cold at once, a balance that only the frontier could create. Sarah rose, brushing the children's hair from their foreheads, Her movements unhurried and calm. She poured water from the kettle, now warm again, into tin cups and set them by the hearth. Steam curled upward, catching the sunlight like smoke from a holy offering. The air smelled of wood, wool, and ash, the scent of a home that had fought back against the wilderness and won. Out on the plains, this victory would never be written down, never sung about, but it was a triumph nonetheless. The quiet victory of those who learned to live with the land instead of against it. Their methods were not primitive, they were perfect. They used the physics of earth and air and body long before science gave them names. And as the morning stretched across the frozen Dakota sky, the Morrison family began another day, mending, preparing, and teaching their children the same lessons that had kept them alive. Cut the wood before the storm, dry the moss in summer, keep the stones by the fire, and never go to bed without checking the coals. Because out here, knowledge was warmth, warmth was life, and life, fragile, stubborn, luminous life, was the only thing worth fighting for. So, if you're listening now from the comfort of your own warm room, remember them, the families who survived the coldest nights, not because they were stronger, but because they understood the quiet language of endurance. The sound of a log settling in the fire, the whisper of wind against the eaves, the simple miracle of waking up to see your breath in the first light of morning. They didn't just endure winter, they mastered it. And in doing so they left behind something far more lasting than cabins or tools. They left behind the knowledge that even when the world turns to ice, warmth can still be built. One ember, one stone, one heartbeat at a time. Let's step back inside that cabin, not as observers now, but as listeners to the quiet rhythm of a world that has learned to live slowly. After breakfast, Thomas sets out to gather wood from the stand of poplar trees half a mile from the cabin. The snow comes up to his knees, and each breath burns in his chest. The axe bites deep into the frozen trunks, sending out the sharp, clean sound that breaks the silence of the morning. Every swing is measured, not rushed, because haste wastes strength, and strength must last until spring. He stacks each log carefully on the sled, brushing off the frost that settles in his beard. Back at home, Sarah scrubs the soot from the kettle with melted snow, humming softly the tune half prayer, half lullaby. The children are helping her by sorting bits of moss and straw, their winter chores. She smiles when she sees them work, their fingers red but steady. Work, she always says, keeps the body warm long after you stop moving. The sun barely clears the horizon before it begins to fall again. Days in the Dakota winter are short and pale, shadows stretching like ribbons across the snow. But in that brief span of daylight, everything is done with care. The logs split, the seams checked, the chimney brushed, the tools dried by the fire. It is a rhythm that gives shape to life, not frantic, not wasteful, simply deliberate. When evening comes, the cabin feels like its own small world. The light outside fades to blue, and the first stars appear through a veil of drifting snow. Inside, the orange glow returns, casting long, soft shadows over the walls. The kettle hums quietly, filling the air with the smell of broth and pine. Sarah knits by the firelight, her needles clicking softly, while Thomas carves a new handle for the shovel he broke the day before. The children have their own ritual now. They sit close to the hearth and press their hands toward the stones, laughing when the warmth tingles their palms. To them the fire is alive, a creature that breathes and speaks in crackles and sparks, and maybe, in a way, it is. Every family that settled the frontier had their own fire god, their own guardian of warmth, though they might not have called it that. Some placed a horseshoe above the hearth for luck. Others carved small wooden charms and set them on the mantel. Sarah keeps a single pine cone there, dark and glossy, picked up on their first journey west. To her, it's a reminder that life sleeps quietly even in the coldest ground, waiting for spring. Outside, the wind starts to rise again. Thomas checks the fire once more before bed, adjusting the damper and banking the coals under a thick layer of ash. He runs a hand along the stones, feeling the warmth stored deep inside, and nods with quiet satisfaction. Soon, the room dims, the lamp is blown out, and the only sound left is the gentle sigh of the flames and the steady breathing of a family at peace. The cabin creaks, the snow presses against the walls, and the world narrows down to a single pool of warmth in a sea of ice. For those who lived here, there was never such a thing as silence, only the soft music of endurance, the whisper of moss between logs, the murmur of wool brushing skin, the soft exhale of a fire holding on through the night. And as the moon climbs above the frozen plains, silver and perfect, it finds the Morrison cabin still standing, a tiny miracle of warmth and willpower in an endless winter. By the time March came, the world began to loosen its hold. The great silence of the prairie, that deep, breathless stillness that had reigned for months, was slowly replaced by sound. The trickle of melting snow from the eaves, the creak of water beneath the ice of the creek, the far-off call of a bird that hadn't been heard since autumn. It was the first language of spring, soft and uncertain, but full of promise. Inside the Morrison cabin, the change felt almost unreal. The walls, which for so long had held the warmth tight, now seemed to breathe. The air was damp and heavy with thawing earth. The fire, once their lifeline, was smaller now, just enough to take the edge off the morning chill. The family moved slower, not from cold, but from the strange disbelief that they had truly made it through. Thomas stepped outside one morning and felt the ground sink slightly beneath his boots, the frozen soil turning back into mud. His breath still showed in the air, but the bite of winter was gone. He looked across the horizon, where the snow still lay in patches, and saw the faint brown of grass returning. A hawk circled above. Somewhere in the woods, a rivulet of meltwater ran with the sound of laughter. When he came back inside, Sarah was already pulling down the furs from the windows, letting the first sunlight pour across the floorboards. It painted the room in gold, catching the dust in slow, dreamlike swirls. The children sat by the door, tracing shapes in the wet mud that clung to their boots, smiling like they had forgotten how to stop. The house looked different now. Not a fortress anymore, but a home again. The same logs that had kept death at bay all winter were now warm with morning light. The stones in the fireplace, blackened with soot, would soon be cool for months. Yet Thomas and Sarah didn't see the wear and smoke stains as imperfections. To them they were proof, a story written in heat and endurance. That afternoon they opened the door wide and carried their bedding outside, spreading the quilts over the fence to air them in the pale sun. Sarah ran her hands along the fabric, smiling at the faint scent of smoke that clung to it. She didn't want it gone. It was part of them now. In the days that followed, the snow retreated in waves, exposing the stumps of old fence posts, forgotten tools, the outlines of paths that had vanished beneath the drifts. The world returned piece by piece. Chickadees landed on the roof. Meltwater dripped into the barrels outside the door. The forest floor darkened and softened. One evening, as twilight returned later than usual, Thomas sat by the door with a small notebook, the one he had kept through the winter. In it were sketches of the fireplace, notes on firewood types, measurements of moss insulation, even records of how long their stones stayed warm. He handed it to Sarah. For next winter, he said. She smiled faintly. For the children, she corrected, because that was what survival meant on the frontier. Not just making it through the storm, but remembering how every technique, every observation, every small miracle of heat and patience would be passed down until it became instinct, until it became tradition. And as the last frost vanished from the meadow and the rivers broke open with rushing sound, the Morrisons stood together outside their cabin, faces turned to the light, shoulders still wrapped in wool, but hearts already thawing. The wilderness had tested them. It had stripped them to the bone, challenged their will, and then handed them back their lives like a sacred gift. In the end, they didn't just endure winter. They learned its language, the balance between fear and preparation, silence and fire, cold and the quiet strength that outlives it. Because every ember once tended with care can outlast the storm. And every winter, no matter how cruel, must eventually bow to spring. As the sun sinks once more behind the frozen hills, the light inside the Morrison cabin grows soft and gold. The fire burns low, the air warm but heavy with the scent of pine smoke and wool. Sarah folds another quilt over the children, careful not to wake them, while Thomas checks the damper one last time before sitting beside her in silence. Outside, the wind begins to rise again. Not violent, not cruel this time, but steady and familiar. It moves through the bare trees and across the white plains like a slow breath. The cabin creaks in reply, its timbers expanding, its stones whispering with heat. The wilderness, vast and endless, presses close, but inside the small room there is order, rhythm, and warmth. A kettle hums softly on the hearth, the windows fog from the inside, catching the glow of the fire and turning it into amber glass. Beyond the door, the snow shifts and sighs, the sky thick with stars. The Morrisons do not speak much. There's no need. Every gesture has meaning. The way Thomas adds a final log, the way Sarah places her hand on his sleeve, the way the flames settle into their slow, steady burn. It's a quiet language learned through survival, the language of those who have made peace with the cold. The children murmur in their sleep, dreaming of the fields that will return when spring finally breaks the earth open again. And for a long moment, everything stands still. The kind of stillness that isn't empty but full of presence. The kind that makes you forget time entirely. Outside, the world waits. Inside, the fire breathes. And winter, though it lingers, no longer feels eternal. By the next night, the air had changed again, not enough for comfort, but enough for hope. The cold still reigned, yet something softer moved beneath it. A kind of looseness in the frost, a hint of thaw in the wind. The snow that once groaned beneath Thomas's boots now whispered, sinking slightly with each step. He could smell damp wood, the scent of hidden earth returning from beneath the ice. That evening he carried in smaller pieces of wood, not the heavy winter logs meant for all-night burning, but thinner splits of birch and maple, the kind that gave a quick, bright heat, good for evenings when the cold began to retreat. The firelight danced differently now, quicker, livelier, its reflection glinting against the window like the shimmer of a spring creek still trapped in sleep. Inside, Sarah had begun to change her rhythm too. She opened the shutters for a short while in the afternoon, letting in a breath of sharp, sunlit air. It filled the cabin with that strange mixture of scents: wood smoke, melting snow, wool, and faint pine sap. The children laughed when the draft pushed through the room and flickered the candlelight, as if the season itself had knocked on the door. Dinner that night was smaller. A pot of beans and cornmeal, the last of the salt pork simmering in the pot. They ate quietly, but there was an ease in their silence now, a gentler rhythm, the kind that comes when danger has not vanished but stepped back a little, watching from afar. Afterward, Sarah began to sort the supplies, setting aside what remained of the moss insulation, checking the condition of the straw beneath the bed. She worked slowly, humming as she did. Maintenance, not panic. The old motions, still careful but no longer urgent. Thomas watched her for a moment, then moved to the door. The horizon outside was pale, the snow glinting under a silver moon. The trees, the same ones that had stood silent for months, now stirred in the lightest wind, their branches trembling with a sound that wasn't quite music, but wasn't silence either. He stood there for a while, listening to the world thaw, not melting, not yet, just softening, like a deep breath after a long-held silence. When he came back in, the cabin was glowing again. The children were asleep beneath their furs, faces turned toward the warmth. Sarah sat beside the fire, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes unfocused but calm. One sit. Be long now, Thomas said quietly. She nodded without looking up. No, she said, her voice low and even. Not long at all. And so they sat, not in fear, not in weariness, but in quiet waiting, the kind that comes after survival, when all that's left to do is watch the season turn, and trust that spring will keep its promise. Outside, the snow shifted again. A single drop of water fell from the edge of the roof, hit the frozen ground, and disappeared into the darkness. By morning, the sound of dripping filled the air, faint at first, then steady, like the slow ticking of a clock that had finally begun to move again. The roof wept quietly in the sun, beads of water rolling down the shingles and freezing again by dusk. The snow no longer shone with that hard blue sheen of deep winter. It had turned soft, porous, full of tiny rivulets that glittered as they ran. Thomas opened the door to fetch wood and stopped halfway down the steps. The snow, once waist-high, now sagged in uneven mounds, revealing patches of brown earth underneath, dark and wet and full of scent. Steam rose from the ground where the sun struck, curling upward into the cold morning air. He crouched and ran his hand over the thawing soil, feeling its texture like something alive waking up. When he came back inside, Sarah was already moving through her quiet spring rituals, subtle ones, half instinct, half tradition. She lifted the blankets from the windows and tied them back with old strips of linen. Light entered the cabin differently now, not weak and white, but golden and clear. It pooled on the table and climbed the walls, showing every grain of the logs, every nick in the old kettle, every thread in the wool shawl she wore. She began opening the storage crates too, sorting what was left: beans, salt, dried apples, a handful of flour. The inventory of another season survived. Each jar that wasn't empty was a victory. Each cracked one a lesson. The children, restless after months indoors, crowded the doorway, staring out toward the yard where the snowdrifts had begun to sag. Lily pointed at a spot where something green pushed through, a blade of grass, fragile and trembling in the wind. James crouched beside it, his breath steaming above it like incense. "It's spring," he whispered, and then laughed softly, as if afraid to wake it. By midday, Thomas took the sled out, not to gather wood this time, but to bring in water. The creek, which had been buried beneath ice since November, now murmured faintly beneath the snow. He followed the sound until he found the edge of running water, dark and clear, cutting through the white. He knelt and watched it slide past, the color of melted sky, soft and perfect. When he returned home, the smell of cooking met him at the door. Sarah was boiling potatoes, the last few from the winter store, and their scent filled the small space with a kind of fragile joy. Steam fogged the windows again, but this time it didn't feel like confinement. It felt alive, like the world breathing back. After they ate, Thomas sat by the fire, mending the handle of a broken axe. The children lay on the floor beside him, tracing patterns in the dust with small sticks. Outside, a single bird began to sing. Just one, tentative, thin but bright enough to stop every motion in the room. Sarah turned slowly toward the window, her eyes softening as the sound filled the silence. It was the same kind of silence they'd lived in all winter, but now it felt different, warmer, hopeful. She didn't speak, and neither did Thomas. They didn't need to. The song itself said everything: that the worst had passed, that life, against all odds, had found its way back to them again. The cabin still smelled of smoke and old wood. The wind still hissed across the plains, and snow still clung stubbornly in the shadows. But beneath all that, something invisible had shifted. Spring was coming, and for the first time in months, the Morrisons didn't just survive the night, they looked forward to tomorrow. By the third week of thaw, the world around them had changed colour. The sky, once the dull grey of endless frost, now carried a gentler shade of blue, wide, forgiving, and bright enough to hurt the eyes after so many months of pale light. The snow retreated in uneven shapes, pulling back from the roots of the trees, from fence posts, from the frozen edges of the creek that now gurgled and sighed like it was telling stories. The air smelled of mud and pine sap and smoke. Thomas stood outside the cabin at dawn, axe in hand, watching the light spill over the prairie. The silence that had defined winter was gone, replaced by 100 small sounds: the creak of wet branches, the call of returning birds, The steady drip of water from the eaves, the sound of life returning. He turned the soil near the cabin with a spade, breaking the crust where frost had finally released its hold. The earth beneath was dark, rich, cold, but workable. Sarah joined him with a small sack of seeds saved from the previous year, each handful measured, protected, like treasure. She didn't plant them yet, just held them, running her fingers through them the way a person touches something sacred. The children played nearby, their boots sinking into soft ground. James dragged a stick through the mud, tracing the outline of what would soon be their garden, while Lily collected bits of moss and twigs to build tiny fences for her imaginary animals. Their laughter, thin and high, carried across the open field like birdsong. Later that morning, Sarah set out their quilts to dry in the sunlight. The wind caught them gently, and for the first time in months, color moved in the air, faded reds and browns, swaying against a sky that finally felt alive again. She brushed dust from the windowsill and left the shutters open, letting the breeze carry the scent of thawing earth inside. Thomas worked near the creek for most of the day, clearing fallen branches, mending the small wooden trough he used for water. His gloves were soaked, but he didn't mind. His hands were steady, strong again. There was a rhythm to it all, the kind of work that warmed him more deeply than fire ever could. That night, the cabin looked different. The same walls, the same stones, but lighter somehow. The heavy breath of winter replaced by the easy pulse of spring. The fire burned smaller now, but the windows glowed gold from the inside, reflecting on the pools of meltwater outside like lanterns. As the family ate their simple supper, bread, potatoes, and a little dried meat, the sound of frogs came faintly from the creek. Sarah smiled when she heard it. "They've come back," she said softly, as though speaking too loud might scare them away. Thomas nodded, chewing quietly, eyes on the fire. Outside, night settled gently over the prairie, no longer harsh or endless, but full of motion. The drip of water, the whisper of wind through thawed reeds, the distant rustle of something alive moving through the brush. Inside, Sarah gathered her children near the hearth and began to tell them a story, not one of danger or fear this time, but of planting, of patience, of how seeds wait all winter in silence before they find their time to grow. Her voice blended with the soft sounds of the thaw, the perfect kind of quiet where the earth listens too. Thomas looked toward the door, where a faint crack of light shone between the planks. The air that came through was still cold, but it carried the scent of new grass. He closed his eyes and breathed it in deeply, as if to remind himself that the cycle had turned once more. The world was waking, and the Morrisons in their small, humble cabin on the edge of the wilderness were waking with it. The next morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of morning that smelled of thawed pine and wet soil, when the air itself seemed to hum with quiet promise. The Morrison cabin stood like a survivor among the softening drifts, its logs darkened by months of smoke and weather, its windows open at last to let in the sound of running water and distant birds. Thomas rose early, before the sun crested the low ridge. He stepped outside and looked over the field behind the cabin, the rough patch of ground they called their farm. For months it had lain under snow, sealed in silence. Now it gleamed with meltwater and streaks of brown earth. He gripped his spade and smiled, the lines in his weathered face deepening. Work had returned, not the desperate labor of survival, but the slow, good kind that rebuilt a season from the ground up. Sarah appeared a little later, carrying the small canvas pouch of seeds. She crouched beside him, running her fingers through the soil. It was still cool, damp but soft enough to turn. "Not ready yet," she said, though there was hope in her voice. "A few more days." She set the seeds on the porch rail in the sun. Beans, corn, a little barley, some squash from last year's garden. Every one of them saved from the summer before, dried and cleaned in autumn, stored through the long winter beside the chimney, where they'd stay warm. Each one, a story of patience. The children helped too, though their idea of work was closer to play. James dragged a small branch through the soil, pretending to plough, while Lily gathered pebbles to line the edges of what she called her tiny field. They laughed often, their boots splattered with mud, their cheeks red from the cold air, their voices carried over the open land, bright and fearless, as if winter had never existed. After breakfast, Thomas began repairing the fence. The wooden posts had shifted under the weight of snow, some cracked, others leaning like tired sentinels. He straightened each one, tamping the soil firm around the base. Sarah handed him the nails warmed in her apron pocket, and he smiled, that quiet smile that came only when his hands had a purpose again. Inside, the cabin changed too. Sarah scrubbed the floors with hot water and ash, then hung the quilts outside until the wind filled them like sails. She wiped the soot from the hearth and polished the kettle until it gleamed faintly in the sunlight. The smell of clean air and wood smoke mingled into something simple and perfect, the scent of a home waking up. By midday, Thomas had finished the repairs and started on something new, a chair to replace the one burned in last winter's emergency fire. The wood came from a fallen birch, pale and smooth, easy to carve. He worked quietly, the sound of his knife soft and steady, shavings curling like ribbons onto the dirt floor. Sarah glanced over from her sewing, her face calm but proud. "It's good to see you building again," she said. He nodded, not looking up. "Feels good to make something that doesn't just keep us alive," he murmured. That evening, when the sun dipped low and the air turned cool again, the family sat on the porch together. The snow line had receded halfway down the valley, and patches of green dotted the far meadow. The creek shimmered like glass in the last light. The children leaned against Sarah, half asleep, while Thomas rested his hands on his knees, watching the horizon. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled, not the hungry cry of winter, but the distant voice of wilderness remembering itself. Sarah spoke softly, almost to the wind. "Do you think next winter will be easier?" Thomas waited a long moment before answering. "Wintercept's never easy," he said finally, "but we shall be ready." The fire crackled behind them, the fields lay waiting, and the stars, so sharp and cold all those months, now shimmered with a softer light. The season of survival was ending. The season of rebuilding had begun, and as the night gathered around their small home, the Morrisons sat together in the cool air, their breath visible, their hearts steady, listening to the quiet drip of melting snow, the sound of the world returning to life. By the time late spring took hold, the prairie had transformed beyond recognition. The last ridges of snow had melted into the soil, leaving behind shallow pools that shimmered in the morning sun. Grass returned in slow waves, tender and green, spreading across the fields where, only weeks before, the wind had buried everything under silence. The air had changed too, no longer thin and sharp, but thick with scent, wet bark, pine sap, the sweetness of thawed earth. Thomas rose with the first light and walked down to the edge of the field. The soil, freshly turned, steamed faintly in the dawn. He knelt, scooping up a handful, letting it crumble through his fingers. It was warm now, ready. Behind him, Sarah emerged with the seed bag slung across her shoulder, her shawl pulled close against the lingering chill. Together they worked without speaking. She dropped the seeds into the shallow furrows he'd carved with the spade, while he covered them gently with his boot. The sound of their movements, the scrape of soil, the whisper of fabric, blended with the murmur of the creek nearby. They didn't need to talk. Every gesture carried memory. Every handful of earth was a promise. The children helped in their own way. James followed his father's path, pressing his small palm against the ground after each seed as though blessing it. Lily scattered handfuls of tiny wildflower seeds along the fence line, laughing when the wind caught them. Sarah smiled, though she didn't stop her rhythm. The work of the land was like a prayer, endless, patient, and full of faith that life would answer. By midday the field lay quiet again, furrowed and dark, rows gleaming with moisture. Thomas wiped the sweat from his brow and leaned on the spade, squinting toward the far horizon. The mountains shimmered faintly, their peaks still white even as the valley bloomed. Somewhere, a meadowlark began to sing. its clear rising note echoing through the open air. Back at the cabin, Sarah prepared lunch. The fire in the hearth burned low, just enough for boiling water. She added dried vegetables, a pinch of salt, and the last of the venison smoked in early winter. The smell filled the room, light and savory. The door stayed open, letting in the breeze. The curtains swayed softly, not from wind this time, but from life returning. That evening, the family sat outside as the sun fell low over the hills. The fields were dark and ready, the world washed in amber light. The sound of frogs drifted from the creek, and the first insects began to hum near the door. The Morrisons ate in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because the quiet itself was a kind of conversation. Thomas watched the smoke from the fire rise into the soft blue dusk, and thought about the winter now behind them. The long nights, the cold that crept through the walls, the sound of wind like a living thing pressing at the door. It felt distant now, almost like a dream. Yet he knew it would return. It always did, and when it came they'd be ready again. Wiser, steadier, their walls stronger, their hands sure. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder. "It's strange," she said softly, "how the land forgets so quickly." Thomas smiled faintly. "Maybe it doesn't forget," he said. "Maybe it forgives." The last light faded from the sky. The stars began to appear, softer now, gentler, reflected in the dark pools of thawed water across the plain. The world, once frozen and still, pulsed quietly with renewal. Inside, the children slept beneath quilts that no longer needed furs on top. The fire burned small but steady, the stones still warm. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, no longer howling but whispering, patient and calm. And in that narrow cabin, surrounded by endless wilderness, the Morrison family sat in the gentle dusk, breathing with the rhythm of the land, no longer fighting to survive it, but living with it again. By early summer, the prairie was unrecognizable, a wide green ocean rippling beneath the slow drift of clouds. The air had lost its sharp edge. It was warm now, soft against the skin, full of hums and distant rustling. Grass reached the height of Thomas's knees, bending gently in the wind. What had been a white wasteland only months before was now alive, restless, moving, growing. The Morrison cabin no longer looked like a fortress against the cold. Its roof had dried, its logs darkened to a deep honey brown, and the moss between the seams gleamed faintly in the sun. The door stood open through most of the day, and the smoke from the hearth was thinner now, more a fragrance than a signal of survival. Every morning began with sound. Birdsong, the chatter of insects, the rush of water from the creek. Sarah rose first, her feet bare on the warm wood floor, and opened the windows to let the wind sweep through. It carried with it the scent of flowers from the meadows and the sharp tang of wild mint. The air itself felt alive. Thomas tended the fields with quiet devotion. The seeds they had planted in the cold soil now pushed through, small rows of green trembling in the morning light. He moved between them slowly, pulling weeds by hand, pressing the loose dirt around the roots. The rhythm of his work was steady and calm, almost meditative. Each plant that survived felt like a victory, not just over the winter, but over the silence it had left behind. Sarah had her own work. The garden near the cabin had begun to bloom, peas climbing their poles, onions pushing up pale shoots, the first leaves of lettuce curling in the sun. She spent the mornings among them, her hands stained with soil, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. Sometimes she would stop, rest her palms on her knees, and just breathe, as if to remind herself that the air no longer bit her skin. The children filled the long days with exploration. Lily followed butterflies through the tall grass, while James waded into the creek to build small dams from stones. Their laughter rang out through the valley, echoing between the hills. They had grown stronger, taller, faces browned by sunlight and curiosity. Sarah would call them back for meals, her voice carrying easily across the open air. In the evenings the family gathered outside to eat, no longer huddled near the fire, but sitting in the open, on the small bench Thomas had built from fallen birch. Supper was simple: vegetables from the garden, a little bread, sometimes fish caught from the creek. As they ate, the light around them changed slowly, deepening from gold to amber to the soft violet of dusk. The prairie seemed endless in those hours. The wind moved through it like a slow tide, brushing the tops of the grass until it shimmered in waves. Far away, the cry of a hawk drifted down from the sky, and the scent of wildflowers lingered in the air like a memory. When night fell, the sound of frogs and crickets took over, a living pulse in the darkness. The stars returned, not cold and hard like winter, but warm, almost soft, reflected faintly in the creek below. Thomas often sat awake for a while after the others had gone to bed, listening. The sounds of summer were not the silence he had known before, but a new kind of quiet, full of motion but gentle, forgiving. He thought about the coming months, the harvest, the next winter, the years that would follow, and felt no dread, only a calm acceptance. The land had taught him something deeper than fear. It had taught him patience. Inside, the children dreamed beneath thinner quilts, their window open to the sound of wind in the grass. Sarah's breathing was soft beside them, her hands still faintly stained with soil even in sleep. The fire burned low, almost out, but that no longer mattered. The cabin held its own warmth now, the warmth of life restored. And outside, beneath the moonlight, the prairie whispered its old secret once more, that every season returns in its time, that nothing stays frozen forever, and that even the smallest flame once kept alive can light a whole summer. By late summer, the prairie glowed with color, golds and ambers under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the horizon. The grass had grown tall and heavy, its tips whispering as they swayed in the afternoon wind. The creek, once a frozen ribbon of silence, now ran bright and clear, its surface flashing with dragonflies and the darting shadows of fish. The Morrison fields stood full and proud. Rows of beans and barley rippled in the breeze, their scent sweet and earthy. The corn reached nearly to Thomas's shoulder, the stalks creaking faintly as he passed between them. Every sound was rich and alive. The hum of bees in the garden, the low rhythm of Sarah's broom sweeping the porch, the laughter of children carried through the tall grass. The days were long and full of motion. Thomas worked from dawn until the light began to bend toward evening, harvesting the earliest crops and tying them in careful bundles. He stacked them by the cabin wall, where the heat of the sun would dry them for storage. The work was hard, but there was a deep calm in it, the satisfaction of seeing the promise of spring turn into something solid, something that could sustain them through the next cold season. Sarah spent her hours in a flurry of quiet preparation. She strung beans on thread to dry above the hearth, boiled jars of vegetables in salted water, and baked small loaves of bread to fill the air with that warm, yeasted scent that could soften even the hardest day. Her hands moved constantly, kneading, chopping, stirring, guided by instinct more than thought. When the afternoons grew too hot, she would step outside and stand in the shade of the cabin, wiping her forehead with the edge of her apron, listening to the hum of insects in the fields. In those moments she sometimes caught herself smiling, not from joy exactly, but from the quiet relief of knowing that, for now, everything was enough. The children had their own kind of harvest. They gathered wild berries from the edge of the woods, their fingers stained deep red, their laughter echoing over the fields. James carried his finds proudly in a tin pail, while Lily wove crowns from tall grass and clover, placing them on her mother's head as if to mark her queen of this small green kingdom. As August ripened, the rhythm of the days slowed. The air grew heavier, tinged with the faintest trace of coolness at dawn. The nights stretched longer, the light fading earlier each evening. Thomas noticed the change first, that subtle shift in the wind that carried with it a whisper of the north. It wasn't winter yet, but it was a reminder, so he began to prepare quietly. He repaired the tools, stacked fresh wood near the door, checked the roof where the snow would soon press heavy again. Sarah inspected the quilts and furs, patched what needed mending, and set aside the thickest wool for the children. They didn't speak of winter, not out of fear but out of respect. It was enough to know it was coming. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the fields, they sat together outside, supper finished, the last warmth of the day clinging to the air. The fields stretched out before them like a painted sea, the colours deep, the light soft and endless. Sarah's hands rested on her lap, still stained faintly with flour. The children lay in the grass nearby, whispering to each other in half-dreams. Thomas looked out at the horizon where the sky touched the earth and said quietly, "We did well this year." Sarah nodded. "We were blessed." The words hung between them for a while, carried gently by the wind. There was no need for more. The world had given, and they had taken just enough. As dusk deepened, the fireflies rose, small drifting lights that blinked across the meadow like scattered embers. The sound of the creek softened into the background, steady and calm. Above them, the stars appeared, one by one like seeds in the dark. Inside, the cabin waited, filled with the smell of grain and smoke, shelves lined with jars and baskets of food, the quiet hum of security. The same walls that had held them through the bitter cold now glowed with life, warm and golden under the lamplight. And outside, the prairie whispered beneath the stars, not of fear, not of survival, but of balance, of the endless circle between hunger and plenty, silence and song, winter and bloom. The Morrisons sat together in that gentle in-between, where the warmth of summer lingered just long enough to make you forget the cold that would come again. But even as the first night winds stirred with the faint scent of frost, Thomas smiled, because this time they would be ready. By mid-autumn the colour had begun to drain from the land. The prairie that once burned gold and green now shimmered with copper and rust, and the tall grasses bowed beneath their own weight, heavy with seed. The air smelled of dry leaves and cooling earth. When the wind swept through the valley, it no longer hummed. It sighed, slow and low, like a great creature settling down to sleep. Thomas felt the shift first in his hands. The axe handle grew cold in the mornings, slick with dew that froze before dawn. He rose earlier now, working in the dim half-light to split logs before the sun climbed high. Each strike echoed sharply through the crisp air. The pile by the cabin wall grew taller every day, each piece neatly stacked, ends facing out to dry. Sarah turned her attention inward. The shelves above the hearth gleamed with rows of glass jars, beans, corn, berries, dried herbs hanging from the rafters in fragrant bundles. The smell of sage and thyme filled the cabin, mingling with the faint smoke of the fire. She worked quietly, her movements slow, deliberate, like the turning of the season itself. The children gathered fallen leaves, pressing them between pages of old letters, marvelling at their colours, scarlet, bronze, ochre, colours that seemed to glow even as the world around them dimmed. In the evenings they would bring them inside and lay them on the table, turning them into garlands that Sarah hung by the windows, little reminders of summer's brightness, trapped in paper and string. The first frost came one night in early October. Thomas woke to find the windows rimmed in white lace, the grass outside brittle and silver. He stepped out into the chill, his breath clouding before him, and looked toward the horizon. The sun was pale and distant now, its warmth thin. He knew that sound, the subtle creak of earth hardening beneath his boots, the quiet announcement that winter was returning. Inside, the cabin was already changing. The thick furs came down from the loft. The shutters were reinforced with leather strips. The moss between the logs was checked and pressed tight again. Sarah boiled tallow for candles, her hands moving rhythmically, filling tin moulds one by one. The smell of wax and smoke filled the room. In the evenings they all gathered by the hearth, not out of fear but out of habit. The fire became the centre again, the circle around which everything turned. Thomas would mend tools while Sarah sewed patches onto the children's coats. James read softly from an old primer, his voice small but steady. Lily curled beside her mother, tracing shapes in the condensation on the window pane. Outside, the world darkened early. The prairie lay still beneath a thin veil of frost. every blade of grass glinting faintly under the moonlight. The wind carried the scent of snow, though none had yet fallen. It was a smell Thomas knew by heart, the quiet warning of the season to come. He added another log to the fire and watched as the flames took hold, licking along the bark until the wood glowed. Sarah glanced up from her stitching. "Almost ready," she said. He nodded, eyes still on the fire. Almost. They both knew what that meant. The rhythm of the year had completed its slow circle. The thaw, the bloom, the harvest, and now the waiting. Soon the snow would come again, piling against the walls, muffling every sound. But this time the fear was gone. The shelves were full, the walls were sealed. The fire was strong. When night deepened and the children fell asleep, Thomas opened the door for a moment and looked out. The sky was thick with stars, the air so cold it seemed to ring when he breathed. Far away, a wolf called once and was answered by another. Then silence. He closed the door gently and let the warmth fold around him. Sarah was already asleep beside the hearth, the light of the fire soft on her face. The cabin creaked softly, but it was the sound of peace, not strain. Outside, frost glittered on the grass like dusted silver. Inside, the last log cracked, sparks rising and fading into the dark. The Morrison family had come full circle, and as the first whisper of snow drifted down from the night sky, they were ready to begin again. The first snow came quietly. No storm, no wind, just a gentle, endless drifting that began before dawn and continued through the day, blanketing the prairie in white. The world seemed to hold its breath. Sound disappeared. Even the creek, once loud and restless, had gone silent beneath its new shell of ice. Thomas opened the door and stood there for a long time, watching. The snow fell in wide, lazy flakes, the kind that spun and wandered before landing, soft as ash. The logs of the cabin were already dusted white. Smoke rose from the chimney in a straight grey line, bending only slightly in the still air. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from remembering a hardship overcome. Behind him, Sarah stirred the fire. It caught quickly now, the wood dry, the hearth clean, the room filled with warmth almost at once, golden and steady. The shelves were lined with jars, the floors swept, the tools hung neatly by the door. Every corner of the cabin carried the quiet assurance of preparation, nothing forgotten, nothing left to chance. The children pressed their faces to the frosted window, their breath fogging the glass as they watched the flakes swirl. "It's come back," Lily whispered. "It always comes back," Sarah answered, laying a hand on her daughter Sep's shoulder. "But so do we." That evening they ate early, the soft crackle of the fire blending with the faint hiss of snow against the shutters. After dinner, Thomas took a small iron pot and placed it near the fire to warm stones for the night. Not out of fear, out of habit, of memory. The stones glowed faintly, their heat a familiar promise that the long hours ahead would be kind. Outside, night fell like ink poured slowly over the land. The snow deepened, covering every trace of earth, every footprint, every remnant of autumn. The horizon disappeared. The world became a single color, a single shape, and in the center of it the Morrison cabin shone, one small light in an ocean of white. Inside, Sarah sang softly to the children as she worked her needle through a patch of wool. Thomas sat nearby, oiling the handle of his axe, though he didn't really need to. It was a way of keeping company with the quiet. When the children were asleep, he opened the door once more and looked out. The snow was deep already, the moon hidden, the light diffuse and silvery. He could see his breath rise, then vanish. For a moment he felt the same stillness that had filled him last winter, that old mix of awe and fear. But now there was only peace. The fire would last till morning, the walls would hold, the cold could come. He stepped back inside and shut the door, the sound soft, final, certain. Sarah looked up from her chair and met his eyes. No words passed between them. They didn't need any. The fire cracked, the cabin settled, the snow whispered against the logs. And there, in that small circle of light, surrounded by silence and storm, the Morrisons lived, not merely surviving but belonging to the land that had tested them and found them worthy. Outside, winter stretched itself across the prairie once again. Inside, warmth bloomed quietly in the dark. Steady, patient, eternal. The wind sighed through the pines. The stars hid behind the clouds, and somewhere far away, spring slept beneath the snow, waiting. Because on the frontier nothing ever ended. It only began again, with fire, with faith, and with the simple, enduring rhythm of life.